Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, here to help you fall asleep with these chilling horror stories. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is, so feel free to leave a comment. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. Get all started. I'm a student at Roosevelt University, and since my sophomore year, I've been living alone in a single room at an old dormitory called Roosevelt Hall, which sits right in the heart of campus. My girlfriend, who I've been with for several years, lives just down the hall. Her room is tastefully decorated and much neater than mine. During the day, I usually hang out at her place, but I sleep in my own room because the beds in Roosevelt Hall are small, and she always wakes up way earlier than I do. Roosevelt Hall is really old. Its thick brick walls seem to hide countless stories, yet the thin, creaky wooden floors make every sound a mysterious puzzle. Upstairs, I constantly hear people pacing around. It almost sounds as if they're stomping heavily on the floor, but I usually ignore it. Last year, a few friends and I were having a laid-back evening in my room, watching the premiere of a TV series we'd been obsessively following. We were all sitting on the floor when suddenly someone knocked on the stairwell door. It turned out that the resident directly below us, clearly annoyed, was asking us to keep it down. She was convinced we were moving furniture around. I'll admit, she came off as a bit unpleasant. By the way, the university recently installed dropped ceilings in the dorm to catch falling paint drips from the old plaster. Renovations are scheduled for next year. One afternoon, after finishing a lecture, I headed to my room 295 on the second floor, to drop off my things before visiting my girlfriend down the hall. When I opened the door at the top of the stairs, right across from my room, a girl was standing there as if she'd knocked and was waiting for an answer. She looked pretty angry. "This is my room," I said. "What's going on?" "I'm writing an essay," she snapped. "And someone in your room is making so much noise I can't think. You need to do something about it." I was taken aback and almost couldn't help but smile. After all, I wasn't even in my room. I still had my backpack and jacket on. She continued accusing me of making loud noises every afternoon over the past few days. I promised I'd look into it and even gave her my cell number so she wouldn't have to climb the stairs every time. I try to be a good neighbor. With one final curt, "Fine then," she stalked back toward the first floor. When I finally stepped into my room, I found, just as expected, nothing out of the ordinary. My unmade bed, a pile of clothes in the corner, an overflowing trash can that was long overdue for emptying, and the blinds drawn. I brushed the incident aside and made my way to my girlfriend's room without a second thought. The next day, a Tuesday, when classes started a little later than usual, I was fiddling on my laptop during a seminar when my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize, though it had a local area code. I let it go to voicemail and texted back, "Hey, I'm in class right now. Can you tell me who this is? I don't have your number saved." Shortly afterward, I received this reply. "Hi, this is Jessica from downstairs. If you're in class, please tell whoever's in your room to stop it. It's even worse than yesterday." I was puzzled that the noises were apparently louder now, even though I wasn't in my room. Quietly, I slipped out of the seminar to call her back. "Hey, listen, this isn't cool. Whether you're hiding someone in your room or whatever, just tell them to damn well stop." Before I could explain that there was no one in my room, she hung up. Completely confused and growing steadily angrier, so angry that I started to imagine the plot of a poorly made horror movie. It hit me. Someone had been sneaking into my room without permission. My door lock is nearly impossible to crack. It has a push-button mechanism that automatically locks with a spring system, and only I have the key. If anyone managed to get in, they'd have to be a real expert. Determined to put an end to this haunting, I dug out an old smartphone on which I installed a security camera app with motion and sound detection. I discreetly set it up in a corner of my room so it would record any movement. That very night, I went to bed feeling oddly secure, convinced that I'd catch the intruder red-handed soon enough. The next day, while I was having a late lunch at a small cafe, my phone vibrated. "Motion detected," read the notification. Without hesitation, I left the cafe, leaving my friend behind, and sprinted back to the dorm. Along the way, I tried to access the live feed from my makeshift security camera, but the Wi-Fi signal was spotty as I passed several buildings. Finally, I switched to my cellular network. Once the connection held, I reached the dorm out of breath, rushed up the stairs and arrived at the hall just outside my door. My door was locked and everything was silent inside. I fumbled for my key, turned it, and flung the door open, storming into my room. But nothing seemed amiss. My security smartphone still lay in the corner, though it had shifted from its original spot and fallen, its camera still pointing toward the door. Then my phone vibrated again. Apparently, the forceful entry into my room had triggered the sensors, and the app now indicated someone was inside. I meticulously searched the room, but found no evidence of a break-in. With trembling fingers, I picked up the old phone to review the recorded footage. There were 2 clips saved. The preview images only showed the lower part of my closed door and part of the opposite wall. It seemed as though the sound had triggered the camera even before anyone came into view. I figured the second clip was just my own frantic arrival, so I opened the first clip. Slowly, I began to hear the faint sound of a doorknob turning. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and someone stepped inside. The camera wasn't perfectly aligned, but I could make out a pair of bright, bare feet and the sight of slim jeans. Definitely not someone I recognized. And in this weather, hardly anyone walks around barefoot. The stranger started pacing slowly with heavy, deliberate steps. He moved between 3 points in the room, so that the video itself seemed to vibrate with the sound of his footsteps. After a few minutes, my precariously positioned smartphone toppled over, leaving only a view of the ceiling, and then the audio cut off abruptly. The second clip began about 15 seconds after the first ended. Apparently, the intruder, upon hearing me approach, panicked and fled the room. Unfortunately, I still didn't get a clear look at his face. Furious, and still careful not to alarm my girlfriend unnecessarily, she tends to be superstitious, I decided I had to put an end to this once and for all. I needed a clear photo of the intruder's face. I dusted off my high-end DSLR camera, which I'd mostly avoided using because of its bulky size and my fear of it being stolen. This camera had its own motion detection and a Wi-Fi connection, so it would automatically snap a photo and upload it to Dropbox as soon as any movement was detected. I set it up on a tripod, aimed it squarely at my door at head height, adjusted it for the fastest shutter speed and autofocus, and left it on while I went to class the next morning. The day passed uneventfully. No texts from Jessica, no strange noises. I assumed the intruder was probably just another student, and that I could later report him to campus security with a photo if he struck again. When my last lecture ended in the afternoon, I headed back to Roosevelt Hall. Barely had I stepped into the corridor when I froze in shock. Right in front of my door stood it, locked, but the brass doorknob was crushed and distorted, barely recognizable in its original position. On either side of the knob were delicate, almost surgical impressions resembling a hand, and the surrounding wood looked as if it had been violently torn away. With a sinking feeling in my stomach, I opened the door. Inside, chaos reigned. My tripod lay toppled on the floor, and my DSLR camera was nowhere to be seen. The small TV on my dresser was shattered. slanted against the wall, the broken screen matching exactly the pattern of the fallen tripod. Glass shards littered the room, and pieces of plastic from the camera's light and tripod adapter were scattered about. Someone had literally crushed my roughly $600 camera by hand and forcefully yanked it off the tripod, presumably to prevent me from recognizing their face. Even in the midst of my shock, I immediately logged into Dropbox on my computer, and there it was, a single photo that had just been uploaded. The image was a bewildering jumble. First, I saw the closed door of my room. Above it hovered the dark silhouette of a faceless figure standing in the open doorway, and then there was a translucent, pitch-black veil covering about half the image. Within that veil, two faintly glowing white dots shone like eyes. The entire photo was crisscrossed by patterns of broken glass and refracted light. In the split second the photo was taken, the intruder, clearly a seasoned pro, had entered my locked room, triggered the camera's shutter by the sound, and then destroyed everything before fleeing in panic. He must have known the camera was connected to the internet. Otherwise, he wouldn't have bolted so dramatically. I moved out as quickly as the university allowed. That was over 8 months ago now. Since then, I've learned from dorm mates that 2 different students moved in and out of that room after I left, and even the downstairs neighbor is long gone. The door was repaired, and the damaged knob replaced. After seeing that photo and never being able to shake the image of my ruined camera, the university offered to cover my remaining housing and meal expenses in an off-campus apartment, and even gave me a significant tuition discount, on the condition that I don't make a big fuss about the incident. Today, I even received an invitation to a private Facebook group from someone I didn't know. It turned out to be an older former student from our university who had started a group called Roosevelt 295, and that was the end of my chapter in that eerie dorm. I held my breath as I slid my key into the slightly rusted lock of my vintage apartment in a historic Williamsburg brownstone in Brooklyn. I stole one last glance at Clara, whose mischievous grin practically dared trouble, like she couldn't wait to see someone unsuspectingly sit on a well-placed whoopee cushion. I pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped into the apartment. "Hey, Jay," I called out into the nearly empty living room. "Clara's been so excited to finally meet you." Without missing a beat, Clara drifted off toward the kitchen while I headed to the bedrooms. Her ponytail bounced in time as she peeked first into the cramped, old-fashioned kitchen and then over into the modest bathroom. In an apartment this small, there weren't many places to hide. I rapped lightly on Matt's door, just a second before I swung it open. A narrow twin bed was wedged against one wall, and on that same wall hung a collection of colorful sports scarves and jerseys. A very typical display for someone who'd once been a fervent fan during his college days here in New York. Scattered on the desk were biology textbooks and 2 empty cans of soda. But Matt himself was nowhere in sight. "He did it again, Jay," Clara laughed. "Sometimes I'm starting to think you made up this roommate." I shrugged in a mix of bemusement and mild exasperation. Should I take that personally? Am I really so terrible company? Clara's laughter filled the room as she drifted back into the living room. It could be worse. My roommate never even leaves the apartment. I'd prefer the opposite, like you. She pulled aside the drapes so that a single beam of sunlight sliced through the dusty air, landing on a check left on the coffee table bearing Matt's unmistakable handwriting. With a teasing finger, she tapped it. "I've got a theory. You don't have a roommate at all. Instead, you're tangled up in some shady business, using this as your trick to launder rent money." I picked up the check. The amount was a bit higher than last month. Apparently, someone had slipped Matt a note that the landlord had raised the rent. Maybe the guy's just terribly shy, Clara suggested. That's not shyness. I mean, when does he ever sleep or even eat? The bed's unmade, so he definitely sleeps here, she countered, holding up an empty package of vegetarian microwave snacks. And you'd never eat that stuff if you didn't have to. Hey, I do eat healthy. At least when I'm at your place, I teased, taking Clara's hand. Everything about being near her made the world feel clearer. That you call microwave snacks healthy is what's really worrying, she ribbed, playfully nudging my stomach. I pulled her in close, and we both collapsed onto the worn-out couch. Eventually, we turned off the TV around midnight, letting our exhaustion edge out the latest Netflix series. Clara headed into the bathroom to get ready for bed, while I walked over to the tall living room window to check if the front door was locked. As I approached the door, I caught a subtle movement out of the corner of my eye. In the hallway leading to the kitchen, a fleeting shadow streaked across the ceiling light before vanishing. Yet, I could still hear Clara rummaging around in the bathroom. A trick of the light, a trick of the light, I murmured. I crept over to the kitchen door and peered inside, empty. Great, now you're driving yourself crazy before bed, I muttered. I switched off the hallway light and made my way back to the bedroom. Clara was already nestled under my blanket. Even though nearly all the lights were off, I could hear her quiet giggling beneath the covers. You're such a wonderful friend. You let me crash in your cozy, warm bed and... She tried to distract me from my nightly routine. Such a caring, thoughtful guy, and... Before she could finish, she squeaked as I yanked the blanket away, leaving her half exposed. Why do you have to do that every single time? She protested, wrestling to pull the blanket back over her shoulders. I kissed her gently and began massaging her back. It's the fastest way to get you right back to me. She returned the kiss, and soon I drifted off, still caught in the soft scent of her hair. Somewhere in the middle of the night, heavy footsteps yanked me from sleep. For a moment, I assumed Clara had gotten up, though as much as I loved sharing a bed with her, sometimes I craved the freedom to stretch out. Half asleep, I reached out and brushed against her. She was still beside me. Suddenly, wide awake, I strained to listen. The muffled creak of footsteps came from near my door. I tried to reassure myself that it was probably just Matt. It's not unusual for your own roommate to wander the apartment at night, I mumbled, deciding to get up and finally say hello. But as soon as I rose, the footsteps quickened. Not a full sprint, but as if someone were suddenly in a hurry. Taking a deep breath, I opened my door. A faint gust of dust brushed my face, making me sneeze. I scanned the darkened hallway. There was no one in sight. Matt's door stood ajar, and his rumpled sheets lay pooled on the floor. Outside, the cool light of a street lamp filtered into the apartment. Matt's room, the kitchen, the living room, all were empty. I grabbed my phone and shot off a quick text. Hey Matt, sorry for the late hour, but I heard noises in the apartment. With all the recent break-ins in the neighborhood, was that you? Within seconds, my phone buzzed back. Sorry if I woke you. I had to cover a last-minute shift at the bodega and popped out for a quick bite. Everything's locked up now. Good night. In the sink, a still damp plate glimmered, and the curtains in front of the big living room window were now open. Had Matt, during his midnight snack, been peering out into the dark Brooklyn street? It seemed odd. When you know so little about your roommate, everything starts to feel strange. I walked back into the living room, verified that the door was indeed locked, and turned to leave. That's when I heard the wind intensify outside. A storm was brewing. I'd felt its approach all day. The trees outside the building swayed violently, their shifting shadows dancing on the wall. I took a couple of steps toward the bedroom when I noticed one of those shadows wasn't moving. It stood unmoving against the living room wall, a short, broad shape with oddly hanging branches. But those branches stretched out and then curled into fists. It wasn't a tree at all. It was the silhouette of a person, silently watching me through the window. Before I could fully process the sight, the shadow reacted to my movement and bolted. Its limbs moved almost like springs catapulting it off the wall. When I spun around, all I saw outside was a quiet street and trees swaying in the wind. I froze for several minutes, waiting until I was convinced the man was long gone. No one wants to admit that a stranger was peering into your living room in the dead of night. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that this was connected to Matt. But why would he be standing outside, watching me, instead of simply using his key to get in? It was creepy, but not enough to wake Clara. So I snuggled back under the blanket and clung to her, even though that unsettling feeling of being observed wouldn't let go. Should I call the police? And what would I even tell them? That my roommate was coming home late? That someone had stood outside my window for a few minutes? The NYPD would probably have far more pressing matters. Eventually, I drifted off again, though my dreams were filled with enormous, glowing yellow eyes lurking above me. Morning arrived with the clatter of dishes and Clara's soft humming in the kitchen. She was already up, so I shuffled in wearing just a t-shirt and shorts. "Good morning," she beamed, pressing a quick kiss to my lips. Dressed in comfortable joggers and a tank top, she looked surprisingly chipper for such an early hour. How she managed that before her first cup of coffee remained a mystery. "Morning. You've got to be leaving today, right?" I asked, knowing she taught dance classes at the local community center. "Yeah, and I'm already 5 minutes late," she replied, glancing at the kitchen clock. She hurried back to the bedroom to change while I poured some coffee into a to-go cup. 5 minutes late is still okay, and since when do they fire volunteers? I teased as I watched her rush down the hall. She only grumbled, finishing her routine in record time. Then, just as she was about to open the door, she spun around. "Oh, and we really need thicker curtains in your room. I felt like someone was watching us last night." And now, with that creepy news, I'm even later. With an apologetic smile, she was off. I wandered back to the bedroom and looked around. The curtains were indeed thin, and while the window only overlooked the side wall of the neighboring building, I still didn't feel safe. On the floor near the door lay black, soot-like dirt. Up on the drop ceiling, the same dark smear was visible. I dragged my desk chair over and climbed up. As I lifted a panel from the ceiling, more black-gray dust trickled down. It was so dim I could barely make anything out until my hand brushed against something hard and smooth. Pulling it free, I knocked over a small bundle of items, as if someone had stashed miscellaneous trinkets up there. Amid the dust, I recognized everything immediately. A hairbrush, a music box, a mug emblazoned with a dancer, and the word "dance" in bold letters. Clutched in my hand was a photograph of Clara and me, taken during our last trip to London. It was everything Clara had brought here in the past few weeks, and then, inexplicably, never retrieved. The ceiling opening was only a few steps from my bed. In my dream, those glowing yellow eyes had watched me from exactly that angle. With a sinking feeling, I grabbed my bag and left the apartment, stepping out into the electrically charged air of the impending storm. I didn't even lock the door. What good would it do when things were happening here that no ordinary door could keep out? A few blocks away, I ducked into a cozy cafe. Outside, dark clouds were already gathering. I loved this cafe for its warm, low lighting and the feeling of being undisturbed. As I settled at a sturdy wooden table, The resident cat came over to rub against my leg. I opened my laptop and navigated to a folder titled Apartment Stuff. Inside lay the oldest document, a PDF of Matt's original Craigslist ad. Although back in these parts, Craigslist was pretty much the only game in town. Hi, I'm looking for a roommate for a 2-bedroom apartment near NYU. I'm a laid-back guy, into reading, basketball, and progressive politics. Drop me a line and we'll set up a time to meet. 2 months ago, I'd called him, only to reach his voicemail. Then Matt had texted back saying he was stuck in a meeting. We exchanged a few messages and agreed we'd get along well. I wired over the first month's rent and deposit. He told me where to find the spare key, tucked behind an air vent in the hall, in case you get here before I do. Since then, I had never seen him. I Googled the apartment's address. The first few entries were the usual roommate sharing sites, including his Craigslist ad. But then, I discovered a brand new listing that had gone online just that morning. This time on Craigslist again. Hi, looking for a female roommate for a 2-bedroom apartment with 1 bath. Great location, safe neighborhood. I'm a dance student. Don't worry, I don't practice in the apartment. Get in touch. Clara. I closed my laptop and stood up. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the sky was a dark slate gray. I was about to call Clara when I noticed an unread text from her. Hey, sweetheart, I left a book in your apartment. I'm heading back quickly. If you're not there, I know where the spare key is. Just as a flash split the sky, I hit call. No answer. I raced back to the apartment, the rain pelting down in sheets. When I reached the door, I fumbled with my key, shoved it into the lock, and burst inside. All the lights were on, though the outside sky was so dark it might as well have been midnight. On the wall now hung our London photo, thoroughly cleared of its layer of dust. I heard a faint click, and the living room light went out. The room plunged into half-darkness, thick black shadows gathering in the corners. I noticed a light switch on the far side. No one was there. I stepped over and flipped it back up. The light came on again. That's when, just a meter to my right, the dark outline of a figure emerged on the wall. Its fingers stretched unnaturally long. For a moment, I thought someone might have been standing by the window, but the drapes were drawn and the light was clearly coming from inside. I spun around, only to see that nobody was there. But as I turned back toward the shadow, it had inched closer. One of its arms detached from the wall and flowed toward me like a wisp of black smoke. It hit me square in the face. A blinding flash burst before my eyes as I felt a shock of pain and tasted blood along my throat, while a wave of nausea overtook me. Jay? Clara's voice came from the bedroom. Jay, is that you? Matt? Her tone wavered with uncertainty. The shadow jerked toward her voice, darting along the walls as its outline wavered in the flickering light. I scrambled to my feet and followed it. In my mind, it felt like I was sprinting down an endless corridor with no one ahead. The shadow leapt from one wall to the other. My bedroom remained brightly lit while the shadow slithered along the doorway instead of barreling straight in. In the narrow gap between the door and the wall, it vanished into darkness. Clara, I shouted. We need to get out of here. As I passed by Matt's room, I noticed that instead of his old sheets, there now lay Clara's pale pink blanket, and on the wall hung several Bolshoi ballet posters, almost as if that room had become hers. I kicked the half-open door, hoping to intercept the shadow if it lurked behind it. The wood slammed against the wall and rebounded sharply. Something cracked, a piece of plaster chipped away, and the shadow's shape wavered before retreating to another corner. Jay, what the hell is happening? Clara's voice trembled with both fear and anger. She stood at the far end of the room, hand outstretched. Her eyes brimmed with worry, but she froze when I grabbed the bed and swung it against the wall, searching for the elusive shadow. "Jay, look at me," she pleaded. I crouched down and peered under the bed. Nothing but stray socks and a jumble of lost toys greeted me. "Jay," her voice now shook with real terror. Her hand remained raised as if reaching out for help, yet her head was unnaturally tilted to one side. Suddenly, I realized her ponytail was no longer loose over her shoulder. It had been pulled back tight into the dark recesses of the wardrobe. Two piercing, glowing yellow eyes stared out from inside. I lunged forward to grab her, just as the dark figure seized a fistful of her hair. Her head jerked backward and she slammed onto the floor, sliding toward the closet. I dived after her, clutching her ankles as she struggled. It was a grotesque contest. Me against this nightmare from the closet. Clara cried out in anger as she fought to break free. From somewhere in the darkness came a guttural, mocking cackle, a sound like a distant, sinister laugh. Then Clara suddenly flung her arms back, letting out a frustrated grunt as the sinister laughter died away abruptly. Her fingernails, stained with blood, were visible. The thing could bleed. A furious, sizzling noise, almost like the skittering of an enormous cockroach, emanated from the closet. The grip on Clara's legs tightened. A flash of lightning turned the room blindingly bright for an instant. And in that moment I saw the contents of the closet as if in a snapshot. A figure, vaguely human, but with spidery, elongated fingers and skin as dark and ragged as torn fabric. Beneath the shredded remnants, I glimpsed violet-gray flesh crisscrossed with yellow veins, oozing blood where Clara's struggle had torn her skin. The being's form resembled a damaged stealth suit, as if its camouflage had been ripped apart. Instinct took over. I reached for the wooden chair next to me and hurled it with every ounce of strength toward the abomination. The light flickered off, but I heard the sickening thud of wood colliding with flesh and bone. The creature howled, and its grip on Clara faltered momentarily. I grabbed her shoulders, and we bolted for the front door. Clara yanked the door open and dashed into the pelting rain. I followed close behind, clutching the photo of us from London that still hung on the wall as a reminder of better times. We didn't stop until we reached her own apartment, a place where, at least for now, we felt safe. In the days that followed, it emerged that local police had been fielding multiple missing persons reports linked to that very address. It seemed there had been a string of inexplicable events every time a new roommate ad went up. I uncovered dozens of vanished individuals who had been associated with this apartment, everyone who had disappeared without a trace. In the most recent days, however, no new report had come in. Where that shadow had gone, I cannot say, and truthfully, I don't want to know. I'm never going back to that apartment. I've taken what was most important, and that has to be enough. A few months ago, I found myself with a new roommate. My father, always worried since I now lived so far from our hometown, insisted that I at least have someone sharing the apartment with me for company and safety. As a young woman living alone in a lively loft in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, I eventually relented. The amusing part of it all was how it happened. I work as a barista at Brewhead Awakening Cafe in downtown Manhattan, and one day my coworker, Andrew, mentioned that his son was looking for a place to stay. I remember that afternoon vividly, during our break at the cafe, in a snug corner in the bustling midtown streets. I casually mentioned to Andrew that I needed a new roommate. His eyes practically lit up as he said, "Really? Then why don't you have him drop by? We can talk things over." I draped my towel over my shoulder, massaged my sore shoulder, and grinned. Before I could say anything more, Andrew eagerly pulled out his smartphone. "My son can be here in about 10 minutes. I'm texting him right now." A bit taken aback by the quick turnaround, I mused that perhaps Andrew was fed up with his son crashing on his couch all the time. The thought that I wouldn't be entirely alone comforted me, even though part of me secretly wished I'd never brought up the subject in the first place. Soon enough, I met my new roommate, Eric. He was about my age, effortlessly cool, and, like his father, whom I'd only briefly glimpsed during our cafe breaks, had a calm yet enigmatic gaze. Eric was friendly and talkative, so much so that I quickly came to think he'd be a tolerable roommate. A few days later, when he showed no odd vibes, I texted him to confirm that he could move in. His enthusiasm was contagious, and even Andrew looked relieved when I mentioned it during my next shift. Eric proved to be an ideal roommate, quiet, tidy, and willing to share the household chores fairly. Although he was amicable, he mostly kept to himself, tapping away on his laptop in his room or curling up in a quiet corner. I liked my space, so it didn't bother me at all. Yet, from the very beginning, one thing gave me an uneasy feeling. Every Wednesday, exactly at the same time, Eric would answer a phone call. He'd clutch his phone, shut his bedroom door as if guarding a secret, and behind that closed door I would often hear hurried whispers, sometimes tinged with panic, as if an intense negotiation was underway. Last night, I decided I'd had enough of the mystery. While I was in our small shared bathroom in the apartment, getting ready for an evening out with friends, I heard that strange phone call again. After waiting about 15 minutes, my curiosity got the better of me. I set aside my curling iron and crept quietly to Eric's door. Pressing my ear against the wood, I listened. The muffled whispers grew louder, but despite my concentration, I could barely decipher the words. I distinctly heard a few rapid knocks against the wall near the window, followed by a conversation that sounded far angrier than his usual calls. Finally, I heard Eric abruptly end the call, toss his phone onto the bed with a sizzle, and mutter several curses. Moments later, silence fell. After a few more minutes, I gave up and returned to the bathroom, trying to distract myself by thinking about the night ahead. Barely had I cleared the communal sink and made my way down the hall when Eric's bedroom door creaked open softly. He stepped out, and as his piercing blue-green eyes met mine, I knew something was about to happen. Before he could utter a word, I casually asked, "I overheard your phone call. Are you really okay?" He shook his head slightly and grinned mischievously. "Oh, that was just my dad." He's on my case again, pushing me to enroll in more classes. He says I need to finish my degree before I turn into a cranky old man. He laughed, and a wave of relief washed over me, though I remained cautious. "You know, my dad is always on my case about college, too," I replied. Suddenly, Eric's eyes brightened with genuine interest as he asked eagerly, "So, how's your psychology class going this semester?" I explained that the day was mostly spent reviewing for an upcoming exam. Nothing new, but still interesting. He nodded, albeit with a hint of disappointment. "Too bad, but I guess you're sick of hearing about my life all the time. Go have fun tonight, Julia." Noticing that he still had something on his mind, I offered, "If you want, I can stay. I don't want your dad to ruin your mood." Eric's smile turned truly warm. He stepped closer until we nearly touched, then slowly wrapped an arm around my waist. Gently, he pressed a kiss to my forehead, murmuring, "I don't want to bring you down either." My heart raced, and my cheeks flushed. I couldn't tell if he was trying to distract me from his outburst or if there was something more behind it. At that very moment, his phone rang. He stiffened, still holding me close, and mumbled, "Damn." Releasing me abruptly, he dashed back into his room to fetch his phone. Moments later, he returned, looking pale and nervous, the phone still incessantly ringing. I have to go now, he stuttered as he answered the call and rushed out the front door. In the hallway, I heard loud shouts and the slam of the stairwell door, a sound echoing through the entire apartment. I stood frozen for a moment. Later that evening, alone and shaken by the events, I decided to drown my unease in a drink. Stepping out into the crisp New York night, I sought refuge in a nearby club. Yet, even as the music pulsed through the air, the memory of Eric's strange behavior wouldn't leave me. Hours later, slightly tipsy, I returned to the apartment. Everything appeared unchanged. The furniture was just as I'd left it, and Eric's door was locked again. He obviously hadn't returned. Relieved that nothing seemed amiss, I retreated to my bedroom, locked the door, and drifted off to sleep, though with a lingering, uneasy feeling in my stomach. The next morning, still bearing the marks of the previous night, I tiptoed out of bed. As I opened my door, I heard noises coming from the kitchen. My heart pounding, I went there, hoping it was nothing serious. To my relief, I found Eric quietly busy in the kitchen. "Hey, Julia, I'm really sorry about last night. My dad and I got into it again over my schooling, and I just lost it. I didn't mean to leave so abruptly," he said, running his dark hair from his forehead. "Maybe a stack of pancakes might help?" he added innocently. I smiled, teasing, "As long as it means I don't have to wash every dish afterward." He laughed, but I noticed he had a bandage on his forearm, perhaps a clue about the mysterious first aid kit I'd spotted in his room the night before. After sharing breakfast and trying to put the awkward night behind us, I spent the rest of the morning in the apartment. With my shift at the cafe not starting until 3 p.m., I discreetly observed Eric. He behaved as though nothing had happened, retreating to his room or working intently on his laptop. Several times I was tempted to look through his Wi-Fi history or computer files for clues, yet I had the nagging feeling that his locked door and constant phone calls revealed more than any digital trace ever could. While I was doing the dishes, I joked, "Are you chatting with your online girlfriend again?" He grinned and replied, "Don't be jealous. I'm just talking to my sister. She needs help with a school project." I'd only ever heard a little about his sister. She was supposedly still in high school and sometimes stayed with Andrew. Whether he spent all his free time online with her remained a mystery to me. Shrugging, I continued stacking the dishes. "Guess I'll go shower before you take over the bathroom," he quipped, heading toward the bathroom while I mechanically scrubbed a pan. Just as I was rinsing off, a searing, white-hot pain shot through my arm. Glancing down, I realized I'd clutched a kitchen knife in the soapy water, slicing deeply across my palm and turning the water a dark, ominous red. I couldn't help but cry out, and in that very moment the water in the bathroom was abruptly shut off, followed by heavy knocking. I sank to the floor, pressing my hand against my chest as dizziness washed over me, when suddenly strong arms lifted me like a bride carried to safety. It was Eric. He cradled me and carried me to the bathroom. My heart pounded as I heard him whisper soothing words. Gently, he sat me on the countertop, leaned me against the wall, then dashed back into his room. Moments later, he returned with a large red first aid kit, the very same one I had noticed the day before. "Relax," he said softly, taking my hand and inspecting the wound. "It's deep, but it won't sever any tendons. You'll have scars, but nothing permanent." Amazed by his medical know-how, I teased, "You sound like a doctor from Grey's Anatomy. Where'd you learn all this?" He flinched briefly before regaining his composure. Carefully, he wrapped my hand in thick gauze, explaining each step as he worked with focused determination. Once my hand was securely bandaged, Eric pressed a quick kiss to my forehead and urged me to get ready for work. Later, as I began my shift at the cafe, taking orders at the counter while assisting another colleague, Marcus, I overheard him quietly discussing Eric's ongoing conflict with his father. Eric never took school seriously. Now he thinks he can just coast through life without finishing his degree, and his dad won't stop harping on about how education is everything, Marcus confided, glancing over his shoulder with concern. Even though we tried to keep the conversation light, I sensed dark secrets lurking beneath the surface. After my shift, I returned to the apartment, tossed my bag and apron onto an old armchair, and sank onto the couch, my mind reeling from the past few days. Moments later, I heard Eric's soft chuckle in the hallway. "Hey, did you at least take off your shoes today?" he teased as he strolled over to the bookshelf in the living room, pulling out a book and flipping through its pages. I tried to mask my exhaustion with humor and replied, "The cafe was brutal today, but at least I got a quick call from my dad in Atlanta." Eric raised an eyebrow. "Atlanta? Your dad lives in Atlanta?" "Yeah, he's a police officer there, and his shifts are all over the place." It struck me then that I had never mentioned my father to Eric. Before I could ponder further, a dull noise interrupted us. Eric jumped up, snatched a book from the floor, and visibly tensed. "Everything okay, Eric?" I asked, worried. He turned away, went to the table, and set the book down tremblingly. I completely forgot that I promised to help my sister Nadine tonight. I really didn't want to bail on her. For a brief moment, he looked almost childlike in his fragility. Then, with a resigned sigh, he pulled a laptop from his backpack, stowed it away hastily, and said in a flat tone, "I'll see you later." Without another glance back, he left the apartment. A few hours later, Eric returned unexpectedly with Nadine. I was astonished. A man who seemed so guarded had now brought a family member home. Nadine entered quietly. Her appearance was striking. Despite the warm New York summer, she wore a thick, dark turtleneck, black trousers, rugged boots, and a long coat, as if shielding herself from the world. Eric introduced her in a subdued tone. "Julia, this is Nadine. We're just here to grab a few things. Then we're off to dinner." I smiled warmly at Nadine, though inside I was desperate for answers. "Eric, you need to tell me what's going on. Why do you always have to run off?" I demanded. He stared at me for a long moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he took my hand, letting his gaze drift over my still bandaged wrist, and whispered, "I want to tell you everything, but I don't know how." Just as we locked eyes, a soft voice spoke behind us. "Eric, I need her to know. She must understand that." Before Nadine could continue, Eric sharply cut her off. "It's too dangerous to say everything now. We have more planning to do." Nadine sighed, and Eric turned back to me, gently cupping my face as he said, "I promise. Soon, everything will make sense. Just trust me." I nodded, though inside I burned with questions over what he was hiding. Later that evening, I received an unexpected message in my inbox from my father. With trembling hands, I read, "Julia, I was only able to find minimal information on Eric and his dad. It seems both leave barely a trace, except something's off. Please, if you can, get 1 or 2 photos of him. Love you, Dad." Attached was a document with the following details. Name: Smith. Adam age, 51. Height, 5 feet 10 inches. Hair, brown eyes, green. Last known address, Charlotte, North Carolina. Name: Smith. Eric age, 25. Height, 6 feet 0 inches. Hair, brown eyes, green. Last known address, Charlotte, North Carolina. That was essentially it. No previous addresses, no details of past employment, no medical records. Something was very wrong. Frustrated, I typed a brief thank you note to my dad and closed my laptop. Trying to distract myself, I began tidying up the apartment, wiping down the kitchen counters, putting away the dishes, and organizing the living room while taking out the trash. While emptying a small paper bin, I noticed a scrap of hair color packaging in a deep brown shade. It wasn't my natural color. I've always had jet black hair, and it could only belong to Eric. I carefully stashed the remnants in a drawer, determined to confront him about it later. After disposing of the trash, I settled onto the couch, hoping for a quiet evening and that, by the end of the night, Eric might finally open up about the truth. No sooner had I sunk in when I heard a soft tapping on the coffee table. Lifting my eyes, I saw a large maroon envelope sitting unassumingly on the table. "I'm back," a tired smile seemed to whisper, and there he was, Eric, looking utterly exhausted, dark circles under eyes that once sparkled with life. Curious, I picked up the envelope and leafed through its contents. Inside were legal documents, several pages outlining custody proceedings. "Custody papers?" I whispered in disbelief. Eric lowered his eyes and explained flatly, "I thought you should know. Nadine might have to live with us if things go south with the police. I needed to see if that's okay with you." Confused, I asked, "But why, Eric? What's really going on?" He shrugged helplessly, unable to give a straight answer. Instead, Nadine, her expression as enigmatic as it was sorrowful, spoke up. "It's too dangerous to reveal everything now. We still have more plans to work out to protect everyone involved." Eric gently took my hand again, meeting my gaze, and whispered, "Trust me, Julia. Soon it will all make sense." With that, he pressed a quick kiss to my cheek, then abruptly left with Nadine. Barely had they gone that a new message flashed on my smartphone, a fresh email from my father. It warned that Eric and I were in serious danger and urged us to contact the police immediately. "Julia, I've uploaded Eric's photo into the system. You need to ensure that both of you go to the police right away. If I don't hear from you within the hour, I'll alert the local authorities. The entire county is on high alert. Delete this message as soon as you read it. Love you. Everything will be all right. Dad." My hands trembled as I noticed an attached newspaper article. A report from 2006 with a bold headline reading, "Local family desperate for answers. Children missing." Below, it was a family photograph. Adam and Nicole Smith, beaming with pride as they posed with their children. A teenage Eric, his light brown hair shining in the sun, and a little girl of about 7, unmistakably Nadine. Suddenly, all the pieces fit together. The mysterious phone calls, the odd first aid supplies, the constant need for secrecy. Eric and Nadine were victims of a long-ago kidnapping that had haunted their family for over a decade. I was stunned and overwhelmed with guilt for having pried too deeply. With a pounding heart, I knocked on Eric's door. It swung open moments later, and he appeared in a state of panicked confusion. "Are you okay?" he asked, breathless, his dark hair falling into his eyes. "Eric, I know what's going on. I read the article. You were kidnapped. So was Nadine. I found out everything," I blurted out through tears. He pulled me into a tight embrace and whispered, "Thank you for trusting me. I never could have gone to the police alone. My dad's pressure has been relentless for years. Marcus, my true guardian, always reminded me that I needed to find my own path." After a moment of calm, he added, "I have to get Nadine. We should go to the station together, so we're all safe." With trembling hands, he left the apartment, and I remained behind, head in my hands as a growing dread settled over me. Shortly afterward, we drove, Eric, Nadine, and I, to Marcus's old house in a quiet suburb of New York, hoping Nadine was stable. When we arrived, several police cruisers were waiting. A young officer with steely eyes directed us to follow him, and before long we found ourselves in a stark interrogation room. "We need to take you both in for further questioning," the officer stated matter-of-factly. As we climbed into the squad car, I clutched Eric's trembling hand and whispered, "They're coming for you. We just have to hold on." Eric nodded weakly, and a heavy silence settled over us as we were driven to the police station. Barely had we arrived when news came that Nadine had been located, alive, though injured. I sat in a sterile waiting area, listening as an officer explained. Nadine sustained several cuts and bruises in an accident. Nothing life-threatening, though the passenger in the vehicle, who was with her, suffered serious head trauma and broken ribs. He's under observation. A surge of relief flooded over me. Moments later, another officer led us to a room where Nadine lay in a hospital bed, surrounded by crisp white sheets and attended to by calm, diligent nurses. Kneeling beside her, Eric took her small hand and murmured, "Nadine, please, stay with us. We're getting you out of here." In her eyes, despite the pain, I saw a spark of defiance and even a trace of hope, as if she were ready to confront her past at last. While we waited for further updates, my father, who had driven in all the way from Atlanta, arrived. He enveloped me in a tight hug and said, "Julia, you did well. Now we're together, and together we'll help this family reclaim their lives." He spoke of his long-standing connection with the Smith family, and of cases he'd worked on years ago as a police officer. His warm yet resolute words gave me strength. A few days later, once Nadine was stable enough, we arranged for her to move into a temporary home, this time in Atlanta where my father could live more securely. With the help of a moving company, we settled into a modest but cozy apartment. Eric and I even began discussing the possibility of staying together permanently once things calmed down. The events of the past days had changed us all. Eric and Nadine, now beginning to reclaim their true identities as members of the Smith family, received the long-overdue therapeutic support they needed. The entire New York community, from neighbors to local shopkeepers, rallied around us, sending flowers, handwritten notes, and small tokens of kindness. Even the police made regular visits to ensure our safety. I now live temporarily with my father in Atlanta, while Eric and Nadine work to leave their haunted past behind and prepare to rebuild a normal life. I've secured a new lease and plan to settle here for good soon. Though memories of those dark days still echo, I feel that a glimmer of hope is emerging. Eric and I have also come to acknowledge our growing feelings for one another. A romance born amidst terror that reminds us new beginnings are always possible. We're even considering getting a place together in Atlanta once everything calms down. In the evenings, as I sit in my little kitchen, savoring the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and listening to the soft murmur of neighbors in the hallway, I remind myself that even in the darkest times, light will eventually break through. The support from my friends, my father, and even kind strangers has shown me that we are never truly alone. Thank you to everyone who stood by me during this crazy adventure, for your kind wishes, encouraging words, and for helping me overcome the terrors of the past. I'll keep you updated as new developments unfold. Until then, never lose faith in a fresh start. We'll see you on the other side, Julia. Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, here to help you fall asleep with these chilling horror stories. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is, so feel free to leave a comment. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. It all started. I was in 6th grade at the time, but my memory of that day remains as vivid now as it was back then, much to my chagrin. Ever since that day in rural Indiana, I've been tormented by recurring nightmares, and the true extent of my emotional scars might never be fully understood. It began like any other day. I trudged to our public middle school in a small Indiana town, grumbling as usual after missing the school bus, a routine occurrence for me. It was mid-September when the early autumn air carried a gentle warmth and a soft breeze that hinted at the coming fall. I grew up in this modest town where our school, catering to grades 1 through 8, had about 200 students, and our bright yellow bus usually crammed 20 to 30 kids. My friends Steve and Luke hopped on at the second stop, and for most of the ride we chatted about the baseball cards and sports stickers we'd recently traded or bought at the local convenience store. It was all so ordinary, so perfectly mundane, that nothing could have prepared us for what was about to happen. During lunch, while I met up with Steve, Luke, and a few other buddies in the schoolyard, something shifted. After eating, we split into small groups and headed over to the open field behind the gymnasium to play our rough-and-tumbles version of touch football tag. In our version, one kid would throw the ball high into the air, and whoever caught it had to sprint at full tilt while the rest of us tried to tackle him down. It was a game fueled by adolescent bravado, messy, loud, and completely unsupervised. Scuffles were frequent, and some of us even got reprimanded later, but we were just kids living for the moment. That day, a ball soared through the air, and Robert caught it. He managed only a few brisk steps before a group of kids descended on him in a flurry of shouts and laughter, their taunts punctuated by an exaggerated "ooh" from a circle of onlookers. The chaos continued until Kyle, our star kicker known for his long shots, ended up with the ball. But where it would finally land was always a roll of the dice. With all his might, Kyle booted the ball, and we watched as it sailed far to the left, heading straight for a small copse of trees bordering the school's athletic fields, roughly 200 feet from our makeshift turf. "Nice shot, Kyle. That was insane," hollered Patrick from across the field. Kyle only grinned in response and even tossed a rebellious middle finger at Patrick before sprinting toward the tree line to retrieve the ball. I stayed behind, watching him approach the wooded edge, his pace slowing as he peered into the dense shadows between the trees. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, something changed. Kyle's entire body stiffened as he halted at the tree line, his eyes locked on something deep within the darkness. For what seemed like a drawn-out 10 seconds, he stood frozen, even as another kid shouted for him to hurry up. When he finally turned back toward us, his mouth hung agape and his eyes were vacant, stripped of their usual spark. "Dude, did you just lose it?" jeered Carl, his tone half mocking, half concerned. But Kyle didn't respond. Instead, his gaze shifted back to the woods. Then, without warning, he collapsed backward, crawling away with a frantic mutter. "No, no, I'm not doing this. Not me." The mocking laughter from our friends filled the air, but Kyle didn't pause to reply. He simply got up and bolted back toward the school, leaving us all with uneasy questions. While the others shrugged it off as one of those weird kid moments, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. I had never seen the fearless, cool Kyle so terrified, and that blank, haunted look in his eyes still haunts me. Steve and I edged our way toward the spot where Kyle had stood. With each step, a growing unease gnawed at us as the excited chatter of our classmates faded behind us. When we reached the edge of the copse, we peered cautiously between the trees. There, lying about 10 feet from the tree line, was the ball. Everything else appeared normal. I'd roamed these woods countless times, and nothing seemed out of place. yet a prickling dread ran down my spine. I stepped into the darkened grove to pick up the ball. The instant my hand touched it, I felt a strange, shifting pressure in the air, as if the very atmosphere had suddenly grown heavier. A faint pop echoed in my ears, and for a split second my balance wavered dangerously. It was the strangest sensation I'd ever experienced, completely unexpected. I paused, heart hammering, to steady myself before picking up the ball. As soon as I stood upright, a warm, damp breath grazed the back of my neck. It smelled sour and carried a rhythm, almost as if someone, or something, were exhaling directly onto my skin. My heart leapt into overdrive as I whipped around, only to find Steve standing a few yards away with a confused, almost pitying look. "You okay, man?" he asked. I wasn't sure what to say. I couldn't even explain the sensation, but I nodded anyway. Admitting fear wasn't something a sixth grader was supposed to do, even if I was shaking inside. "Did you see anything behind you?" I asked in a hushed tone. Steve shook his head. He was too far away to have caused the disturbance, and if he'd crept up close, I'd have heard the rustle of dry leaves. A shiver ran down my spine as I clutched the ball and rejoined the others. My appetite for the game evaporated, replaced by a gnawing, irrational worry. Something wasn't right, like unseen eyes were tracking us from the depths of the trees. I thought of looking for Kyle, but before I could decide, the shrill ring of the school bell signaled the end of recess. My next class was math, and I spent most of it trying to push away that lingering unease. About 20 minutes in, I realized I needed to use the restroom. Ms. Thompson, my math teacher, excused me, and I grabbed a flimsy plastic hall pass as I left the classroom. Walking down the corridor, I noticed something odd. The hallway outside had suddenly grown dim. It wasn't the inky black of night, but a heavy, unnatural dusk that contrasted sharply with the bright midday sun we'd enjoyed during lunch. Shrugging off the uneasy feeling, I continued toward the restroom. Our school wasn't sprawling, just a compact older building of about 70,000 square feet, located on the outskirts of town, roughly a mile from the nearest police station. While I washed my hands, the overhead fluorescent lights flickered momentarily, a common occurrence in such an aging structure prone to electrical hiccups. The lights soon steadied, and I stepped back into the hall. That's when I stopped dead. Outside the restroom, the corridor was shrouded in near total darkness, as if someone had flipped a switch and ushered in nightfall. My first thought was, what, is there an eclipse? But that idea evaporated the moment I saw a figure dashing down the hall from the administrative office. It was Principal Johnson, a man in his 50s, sprinting toward the main entrance as he hurriedly bolted the doors. When he caught sight of me, his eyes were filled with unbridled terror. "Get back to your classroom immediately. Tell Ms. Thompson, it's an armed intruder alert," he shouted in a panicked tone. My heart sank as I sensed the urgency and dread in his voice. Without a second thought, I ran back to my classroom, throwing open the door and stealing one last anxious glance over my shoulder. Something was gravely wrong. Ms. Thompson initially scolded me for bursting in so wildly, but the terror etched on my face softened her expression from annoyance to deep concern. "Armed intruder alert," I stammered, the words barely audible. Her eyes widened as she quickly barked out, "Lock the door! Everyone, get to the back corner, quietly now!" Following her orders, we huddled together in the far corner of the room, hidden from view. I turned the key in the lock while Miss Thompson approached to ensure the door was secure. Then she retreated to her desk, picked up the phone, and relayed the alert over the school's PA system. We crouched in our hiding spots, just as we'd practiced during countless lockdown drills. Miss Thompson switched off the overhead lights, plunging us into a suffocating, eerie silence. I could faintly hear muffled sounds echoing in the hall outside, which gradually faded away as we all held our breath. Most American students know that an armed intruder alert means you hide, trusting that a locked door and silent corners will keep you safe. "Eric, what did you see out there?" whispered one of the girls. Ms. Thompson quickly hushed us all, and I couldn't find the words to answer. The same questions churned in my mind. What had Principal Johnson seen to send him into such a panic? And what was with the sudden, unnatural darkness that had swallowed the hall, as if the world outside had turned upside down? A few minutes later, the hallway lights flickered off completely, and the corridor was engulfed in pitch darkness. Not even a faint glow seeped through the narrow windows. It was as if night itself had descended upon our school. I could barely make out my own hand in front of me. We sat in tense silence for what felt like an eternity until a loud clattering and a metallic grinding shattered the quiet. My heart pounded wildly as I heard quiet sobs from some of my classmates. Ms. Thompson tried to calm us, yet I could see the same terror reflected in her eyes. She crept over to the small window by the door, peered out, and then gasped, covering her mouth with trembling fingers, tears welling in her eyes. Then, without warning, the classroom grew brighter. Not because the overhead lights had been restored, but because a strange, pulsating glow emanated from the hall. It was an intense, almost blood-red flicker, as if someone was carrying a bizarre lantern. The light danced erratically, pulsing with an uneven rhythm that was more unsettling than any ordinary flashlight. I've tried for years to describe that glow, or even replicate it, but nothing has ever come close. At the same moment, I began to hear a wet, slapping sound, as if someone was trudging through swampy ground toward our classroom. The eerie glow grew stronger, and my stomach churned with dread as I realized the light must be right outside our door. We all sat motionless in our hidden corner, too terrified even to breathe. Then, slowly and deliberately, something lightly tapped on the door. A dull, rhythmic thud, followed by a faint rattling of the door handle. Not a single whisper stirred among us. All I could hear was the soft click of an unknown hand fiddling with the knob. The red glow flickered through the narrow side window, dancing wildly in the darkness. We were positioned so that we couldn't be seen directly from the window, and we silently prayed that whoever was out there wouldn't manage to open our door. It felt like an eternity, though only a few heartbeats passed, before the rattling ceased and the heavy footsteps receded into the darkness. The unsettling glow gradually faded away. Our brief moment of relief was shattered almost immediately when an ear-piercing, unearthly shriek rang out down the hall, a cry filled with raw, unadulterated terror. This was quickly followed by a series of heavy bangs, as if furniture were being violently thrown about. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped, leaving us in an oppressive, stifling silence. Hours seemed to stretch out in that darkness as we huddled together, intermittently jolted by distant screams and eerie sounds reverberating through the hallways. Whatever was out there, it never managed to breach the sanctuary of our locked classroom door. Eventually, the outside world began to brighten again, almost as if a surreal sunrise were breaking through the gloom. I checked my digital watch. It was just before 5 p.m. Whatever was happening outside was far from a normal dusk. Soon after, the mournful wail of police sirens filled the air. Within minutes, dozens of police officers and a SWAT team stormed the school, combing through each room before ushering us outside. I can't begin to describe the relief I felt at finally leaving that nightmare of a building. Yet what greeted us was deeply disturbing. Shattered windows, twisted metal door frames, partially collapsed walls, and in several areas, surfaces appeared as if they had been scorched by an intense beam of heat. Some of the lockers looked melted, as though they'd been subjected to an inexplicable burst of energy, though no fire had ever been reported. Outside, my parents and older sister were waiting anxiously. They embraced me along with many other families as police cordoned off the area with caution tape and barricades, treating our school like a high-security crime scene. I asked my parents what had happened, but they could only shake their heads in disbelief. We drove home in silence, each of us hoping that would mark the end of the ordeal. But the night's events were only the beginning of a series of inexplicable mysteries. That very evening, I suddenly fell violently ill. Nausea that left me vomiting repeatedly, coupled with pounding headaches that throbbed like relentless drumbeats. My parents initially chalked it up to shock and adrenaline, until they learned that several other families in our community were experiencing similar symptoms. Before I could even process what was happening, a group of men in full-body hazmat suits arrived at our home. They conducted a battery of tests, assuring us it was merely a precaution. In a matter of hours, I was separated from my parents and sister, not to see them again for several long days. There was mounting fear that we might have been exposed to something toxic, perhaps a clandestine chemical agent or even a biological threat linked to the incident at school. I started to feel better the next day, and surprisingly, all tests came back within normal limits. Eventually, authorities revealed that the exposure wasn't due to bacteria, viruses, or mold, but rather a subtle but measurable radiation level found in me and several other children. Thankfully, it wasn't enough to cause lasting harm, but explaining such a phenomenon left us all baffled. To this day, that question remains unanswered. For nearly a month, our school was shuttered, a fact I secretly welcomed. When we were finally allowed to return, no official explanation was ever given. We were expected to simply act as if nothing had happened. No local news stories, no interviews, no national media. It was as if the entire episode had been scrubbed from history. If it weren't for the memories of those of us who lived through it, there'd be no trace that anything unusual ever occurred. Kyle, the boy from that fateful afternoon, never reappeared in class after lunch. Rumors swirled for months. Some whispered he'd been involved in the incident. Others speculated he had discovered something he shouldn't have. The fact remains, nearly 15 years have passed, and no one has seen him again. And he wasn't the only one. Principal Johnson, the very man I encountered dashing down the hall, vanished without a trace, as did one of the school's custodians. The police never found any bodies or evidence of a violent disappearance. Officially, they're all still listed as missing. I doubt that will ever change. My parents later confided that local law enforcement had told them a dangerous criminal had somehow infiltrated our school grounds. A criminal with the bizarre ability to create an artificial eclipse, warp metal doors, melt lockers, and trigger inexplicable radiation. For the record, no official solar eclipse was ever recorded that day. I even checked the records. Nothing of the sort occurred. In the weeks that followed, the school grounds were cordoned off completely. Streets were closed, police patrolled up to the edge of the nearby woods, and every so often, we'd spot vehicles with tinted windows or unmarked vans carrying suited officials who refused to identify themselves. It all felt less like a standard investigation and more like a covert government operation, one designed to keep us in the dark about what really happened. I even overheard my parents whispering one night. My father said he didn't believe the school would ever reopen, that what we experienced wasn't standard police work at all, but rather a cover-up. And yet, after some time, the school did reopen, much to everyone's bewilderment. To this day, I still don't know what truly happened that day. I've talked to several of my old classmates. Luke thinks it might have been extraterrestrial. while Steve speculates that our school was somehow shifted into another dimension. Their theories sound far-fetched, but there simply aren't any straightforward explanations. Given the silence, the mysterious investigations, and the odd behavior of the authorities, it's hard not to believe that something unexplainable occurred. A secret that was deliberately swept under the rug. Whatever it was, I believe Kyle saw it, and that's why he disappeared. When classes finally resumed, the entire atmosphere had shifted. We slogged through the school year, but bizarre incidents continued to punctuate our everyday lives. Several classmates claimed they'd seen shadowy figures or uncanny presences lurking in the hallways. Some suffered panic attacks or even full-blown nervous breakdowns. A few were even admitted to local hospitals for what was later diagnosed as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Perhaps it was the lingering impact of that traumatic day, or perhaps something darker still lingered within those walls. Since then, nightmares and episodes of sleep paralysis have haunted me. There are stretches of months when the memories lie dormant, only to return with the force of a tidal wave, dredging up old fears and insecurities. It's nearly impossible to describe how visceral and real those nights feel. I wouldn't wish that terror on anyone. I used to believe that one day I'd look back on that day and chalk it up to nothing more than an overreaction of a child. But as I've grown older, more questions have emerged, and the memories have grown increasingly unsettling. As children, we could compartmentalize and forget, but as adults, our minds keep returning to that day, an indelible mark on our lives. I've come to realize that while we cling to the belief that our lives follow a predictable, safe path, there are forces and events that can shatter our sense of order in an instant. Things that defy our understanding and lie far beyond our control. Sometimes we catch a glimpse of what lurks beyond the familiar, a glimpse that leaves us forever changed, haunted by the knowledge that there may be more lurking in the shadows than we ever imagined. Active shooter drills have become as common as fire drills these days. I'm sure every school district has its own twist on the procedure, but the basics are always the same. All students gather in a classroom, the door is locked, the lights are turned off, and everyone huddles in a corner out of sight from any windows or doors, becoming invisible to any potential armed intruder roaming the halls. Without these rehearsals, the situation would spiral into chaos, as it did in the very early days of school shootings, with frantic students scattering in every direction and a terrorized shooter finding too many targets. In that chaos, far more children would be hurt or killed. I used to work as a school social worker at Lincoln Elementary in Cleveland, Ohio. That position was actually my second. My first job, which lasted over 2 harrowing years, was a living nightmare. My first school was a mess from top to bottom, largely because of the principal. He was an aging, burned-out man with a wild shock of white hair and crumpled shirts, rarely seen with a tie. It was as if he had given up on everything and was simply counting the days until retirement. He barely acknowledged my work and would roll his eyes whenever a student was sent my way with a problem. In his mind, this generation was just soft. Kids were never depressed or scared, just whiny. He handed out detentions and punishments without even bothering to find out what really happened, and he treated the entire staff poorly. And he completely disregarded the lockdown drills. I'll never forget the first fire drill at that school. I stood out on the playground in the biting autumn wind, surrounded by shivering, confused children, while the teachers struggled to keep track of everyone. The team and I tried to schedule more drills and get the principal involved in the process, but he simply didn't care. Eventually, he was forced out by the staff's insistence, but by then, I had lost all motivation and desperately needed a fresh start. That fresh start came at Lincoln Elementary. The new principal, tall, lean, about 50 years old, with a strong jawline and warm eyes, and almost always sporting a tie emblazoned with some quirky cartoon, took his role very seriously, as did the rest of the staff. At first, it was intimidating for me to share my ideas at meetings, but slowly, as everyone saw how much I cared for the students, I was accepted. I loved working there. I resigned 2 months later. The reason for that resignation still haunts me. I still dream about it. I still hear the sounds. Sounds that, in the moment they occurred, made no sense, until, in retrospect, they fused into a horrifying realization. It was an ordinary day. I was doing my usual rounds, checking in on the students who needed extra support in class, making sure no one was on the verge of a breakdown. I was actually relieved to be moving about freely after spending some time in the nurse's office with a first grader who'd slipped on the freshly mopped floor. Fortunately, nothing serious had happened, but I had advised our janitor to put up a "Caution, wet floor" sign in plain sight, lest we run into insurance issues. Everything was going smoothly until "Active shooter alert! Active shooter alert! Active shooter alert!" A voice over the school's PA system announced. At first, I was stunned. Then I felt my heart lurch, and a chill prick my fingertips as I realized why I was so surprised. There had been no drill scheduled for that day. This was real. The announcement came just as I opened the door to check on a first-grade classroom. As soon as the PA fell silent, I caught the eye of the teacher, Ms. Miller, who was holding a pointer in one hand. We stood frozen for a few seconds, our eyes locked, her gaze steady and mine full of concern. In that moment, we silently agreed to follow the routine. We both took a deep breath and offered reassuring smiles to the children, as if nothing was amiss. "All right, kids," Ms. Miller said gently. "It looks like we're on an active shooter drill. Let's show Ms. Johnson how well you can do this." "Great idea," I replied, closing the door and pulling the curtain across the small observation window. "I can't wait to see how perfectly you all handle this. Maybe there'll even be a little reward for doing such a great job." Then a thought struck me. I turned to her and said quietly, "Janine, I'm stepping out for a moment. I'll be right back." And I bolted into the hallway. I knew the fourth graders were further down the corridor, spread out as they hung up Christmas decorations on the walls. I feared that in the confusion they might push and shove each other, crowding into a classroom instead of calmly moving to the nearest safe room as the protocol demanded. To my relief, it wasn't as chaotic as I'd feared. Everyone moved quietly and deliberately. I helped a few confused kids find the closest safe classroom and was about to return to the first grade room when something caught my eye from the corner of my vision. I turned and looked toward the exit doors at the far end of the hall and murmured, "Really?" There, in the half-light by a door where the afternoon sun streamed in through the windows, crouched a third grader. He sat with his knees pulled up, his hoodie pulled over his head. I recognized him immediately, Leon. No doubt he was scribbling in his sketchbook again and listening to music on his headphones, even though cell phones and MP3 players were strictly forbidden. He'd been warned many times, yet somehow he always managed to sneak them in. Honestly, I'd often seen him with earplugs and just look the other way. Music and drawing were his therapy, and he had a hard time at home. I hurried over, gently pulled his hood back, and removed his headphones. "Leon, active shooter alert. Come with me," I said softly, trying to sound calmer than I felt so as not to startle him. Leon, like all the students here, took these drills very seriously. His eyes widened and he sprang to his feet. We headed to the nearest room, the computer lab, and I quickly unlocked the door with my key. Then I paused. I should have stayed with him in there, but my thoughts went to Ms. Miller. a bright second-year teacher whose classroom support teacher was out sick. I had a nagging feeling that she might need help urgently. No one knew how long this would take, and the first graders might need extra attention. So, I closed the door behind Leon and turned back. I was now likely the last person left in this deserted corridor. It was eerie. There was no one around, and the only sound was my own rapid breathing. The hall felt abandoned, almost like a cave. Suddenly, I heard footsteps, heavy, rhythmic thumps against the tiled floor. Were they from heavy shoes, or perhaps rubber-soled sneakers? The sound was too loud for just running kids, too soft for heavy boots. Maybe the person was tall, and they weren't far away. For a moment, I recalled the layout of the school. It was a one-story building. Viewed from above, the hallways resembled two squares stacked closely together. The upper block housing the main entrance, connected by a central corridor to the lower block. I stood in the southwest corner of the lower block, near the left side. Yet those footsteps came from the northern upper block on the left side. If I rounded that corner, I would inevitably be heading toward whoever was there. But Miss Miller's classroom was right down that very hall. I slipped off my flat shoes and crept on tiptoe toward the corner. I was about to peek around when I hesitated, fearful of being discovered. The footsteps stopped. I heard a firm twist on a doorknob, then a low, irritated whisper, and the man moved on. Yes, it was unmistakably a man's voice. Why did I stand there listening? I could have darted into the nearest classroom. Yet something compelled me to remain, almost as if I needed to watch what might happen with Miss Miller. The man rattled another door and murmured again. For a brief moment, I considered sprinting to the classroom and unlocking the door. But then I realized he would surely see me, drawing unwanted attention to the classroom and potentially endangering the children. Besides, what if I couldn't get the key in time? I took a step back, ready to dash to the opposite corner if he came closer. But then his footsteps shifted. I held my breath and listened as he turned into the central corridor. Relieved, I peeked around the corner. The hallway was empty, though I could hear him fumbling with some door further down. He was now moving through the central tract. Just then, the door to Miss Miller's classroom opened silently. I saw her face emerge into the dark gap, and our eyes met. She mouthed a signal. Without a second thought, I ran, darting into her classroom. As soon as I entered, Janine carefully closed the door behind me. Inside, all the children were huddled in the darkest corner of the room, their eyes wide with fear as they stared at us. "Have you lost your mind?" I hissed at Janine. "You're never supposed to open the door during an active shooter alert." "Well, I had a bad feeling when you said you'd come right back, and then I heard footsteps outside that sounded just like yours. So I took the risk," she replied. My shoulders slumped in relief. "Thank you, Janine." She mustered a wan smile in the dim light. "Just help me keep the kids calm," and a noise from the hall cut her off. Not right at the door, but somewhere in the corridor, a dull thump. "What was that?" a boy asked. We signaled for silence and listened. Silence. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. Janine and I handed out coloring books and crayons to keep the children busy, hoping to distract them from panic or bickering. But one little girl didn't draw. Instead, she watched us with huge, frightened eyes. Sensing that she knew this wasn't a drill, I sat on a tiny chair and beckoned her over. Without hesitation, she jumped into my lap and buried her face in my shoulder. I held her close and whispered soothing words. A few other children noticed and began to get nervous. They could sense that this was all far more serious than we pretended. At that moment, we heard footsteps again. We froze. The steps approached directly toward us. Janine and I exchanged glances. Her face had turned as pale as chalk. This time, the steps were slower, uneven, lacking rhythm. At one moment, it sounded as if someone was leaning against the wall, their clothing scraping the plaster. Was the person injured? Then the steps resumed, firm and getting closer. I stared at the door. The little girl in my arms clutched me tightly. We were as still as statues. My ears rang, and I dared not blink as I fixated on the doorknob. Then, bang! It sounded as though someone had thrown their entire body against the door. The children screamed. Janine let out a piercing cry. I nearly joined in, but forced myself to focus, gently setting the girl down and sprinting to Janine. I grabbed her by the shoulders, silencing her as I pointed at the terrified children. In that crushing moment, it all blurred. The screams, the darkness of the room, the deafening impact at the door. Janine and I exchanged one desperate look, a single thought shared between us. The children. We had to protect them. Nothing else mattered. "Move that shelf," Janine commanded. I understood immediately and nodded. "Grab the blanket, will you?" I replied, clenching my teeth. Janine nodded. We split up. I raced to the large supply cabinet, a hodgepodge of craft materials and cleaning supplies, not heavy textbooks, and began to push it against the door. "Janin?" I called. "I got it. Hurry up," she replied, her voice strained. The cabinet scraped along the floor as I shoved it with all my might. Gradually, it inched into position, becoming a barricade before the door. Meanwhile, Janine secured a big green fleece blanket over the makeshift barrier, draping it between the code area and another cabinet so that it formed a tent-like cover over the children. That gave them a little sense of security. I heard her soothing them, softly urging calm. Outside, the man pounded on the door again, producing a deep, guttural sound. I panted, summoning one final burst of strength to push the cabinet firmly in place. Then I spun around and leaned back, exhausted. "Where's Miss Johnson?" a child called out. Others began calling my name in a rising panic. "I'm right here, kids," I said as cheerfully as possible, though my voice trembled. "You're all our fortress, and I'm your guard." Janine chimed in. "That's right. Miss Johnson is on watch. She'll let us know when it's safe." "Are we safe?" "All is well, for now. The danger was here briefly, but it's moved on. We're safe now," I reassured them, silently begging for no more thundering on that door. Then came nothing. The doorknob stayed still, and there were no more footsteps. Just silence. After a few minutes, I sank onto the floor against the cabinet, still catching my breath. The children had calmed down. Janine was softly chatting with them and passing out crayons. I was slowly coming down from the adrenaline high when I looked out the window. Red and blue flashing lights danced in rhythm across the room. It was the police. Relief mingled with nausea as I felt a sudden, sharp, metallic scent in the air. I brushed my hand across my nose, thinking I might be bleeding, but saw nothing. The flashing lights crawled over the ceiling. "Look, everyone," I croaked, forcing a smile. "The police are here." A few children cheered softly. They had noticed the lights. I wanted to say something, maybe remind them to stay quiet, but instead, I gagged briefly. Nothing came out except a faint sound that I had to spit out. Then I felt something warm under me. My skin was slick with sweat, and suddenly my trousers were damp around the thighs. Did I wet myself? I thought, momentarily embarrassed. I shifted to look. On the bright tiled floor, however, was a dark, viscous stain, too thick to be urine, and it didn't smell like it either. Instead, that same stinging metallic odor overwhelmed me again. As I stepped away from the cabinet, I realized that the wetness was seeping in from beneath the door. It wasn't my sweat, it was blood. A chill ran through me, No. There was actual blood flowing under the door into our classroom. Then we heard footsteps outside again. This time, they sounded calmer, accompanied by low voices and the crackle of radio chatter. The police had arrived. They moved with a disconcerting calm. We heard them approach our door, then come to a halt right outside. They said nothing. The only sound was the static of their radios. Why were they hesitating? Suddenly, from somewhere in the hall, a hushed, strangled exclamation escaped. "Holy," followed by rapid, heavy steps as they closed in on our door. After what felt like an eternity, a PA announcement came. All clear for all classrooms. Except for our room. There was no all clear for us. Janine and I said nothing in protest. We asked no questions. We were too exhausted, too confused. At that point, all we hoped for was that this nightmare would end quickly and we'd be allowed to go home. I whispered to Janine to drape the blanket over both me and the dark stain on the floor before she turned on the lights so the children could stretch. Then, in a low voice, I told her about the blood. She just shook her head in a dazed manner and looked at me as if to say, "What else is going to happen?" Eventually, after more than an hour, officers unlocked the window latches. Janine, the children, and I climbed out one by one, so we wouldn't have to open the classroom door and possibly see what lay beyond. One of the officers noticed me kneeling oddly on the lawn. "I have blood on me. It's not mine," I said simply, compelled to mention it. The officer gave a curt nod, showing no surprise, then led us to the ambulance for a quick checkup. Once the paramedics gave us the all clear, 2 other officers approached. At first, they stood with their eyes downcast. Then they removed their hats and said in hushed tones that right outside Miss Miller's classroom door lay a body. What do you say in a moment like that? They paused, as if giving us space to absorb the news. Janine and I exchanged glances. They looked at us. What did they expect from us? They didn't really wait for an answer, though. They let the news sink in before moving on. This time, we reacted explosively. Jumping up, shouting, "Why? How can this be?" We panicked as if the heavens had just fallen. The body belonged to the principal. The officers tried to calm us down. Once we managed to settle enough to listen, one of them explained what had happened. Then they looked at each other and finally at me. "We can show you what happened." I felt my throat tighten. The other officer hurriedly added, "On the surveillance cameras, you won't have to, well, you won't see him directly." The video footage, they were clearly speaking directly to me. Janine remained silent. At the time, I didn't quite understand. But in retrospect, I believe everyone felt that I had the right to know every detail. After all, I was the one with the unfamiliar blood staining my pants. They took me into the administrative office. There sat a plainclothes man at a desk computer in the secretary's office, waiting. When the officers nodded for me, he started the video. On the screen were 9 surveillance clips arranged in a grid. 3 across, 3 down, all in black and white. The chaos was evident at the start of the alert. Students rushing through the hallways, darting into classrooms. Within less than a minute, the corridors emptied. My attention fixed immediately on 2 segments. In one, I saw myself, slipping off my shoes and creeping on tiptoes. In the other, I saw the principal, Daniel Hoffman, walking down the left hallway. He stopped before a door, checking its handle. One of the officers murmured, "I guess the school got new doors, huh?" New locks? Yes, we did. Many rooms had recently been refitted with new doors and locks, meaning not every teacher or staff member had the proper key. He was just making sure no one was trapped in a room that couldn't be opened from the inside. I swallowed hard as I watched my own image shrink on the monitor. out of fear that the threat wasn't coming from him at all. The principal rounded a corner, and moments later, I saw him in Miss Miller's corridor. There, on the screen, he checked one last door and seemed satisfied that everything was in order. He leaned in, muttered something like, "All's good, it's just me, no worries," then straightened up. That's when I noticed a "Caution, wet floor" sign just a few feet away. I suddenly realized what was coming. The principal actually slipped, making a sort of awkward, involuntary dance before his head slammed against the floor. There was no sound in the recording, yet in my mind I could hear the dull thud we'd all wondered about earlier. "God," I whispered. That was his head. No one answered. On the black and white screen, I watched him stagger to his feet. A dark stain remained on the floor where he'd hit his head. His legs trembled as he looked down the hall, one hand clutching his head, staggering back toward the central corridor. Then he fell again. From the wound on his head, dark fluid slowly dripped. With mounting fatigue, he sank to his knees, as if overcome by a sudden exhaustion. Finally, he collapsed onto the floor. The man at the computer rewound the video to 22 minutes earlier. In that span, the dark stain on the floor had grown into a large, spreading pool. Then, shockingly, I saw the principal stir, rise, gaze in dismay at the blood, and carefully skirt around it. Something tumbled from his pocket. He didn't seem to notice. He staggered down the hall toward Miss Miller's room. He tottered, needing to lean on the wall now and then, his shoulder scraping against it, before finally righting himself. At last, he reached the classroom door and collapsed against it. Inside, the tremor of his fall had sent shudders through our room. He raised an arm, banged it hard against the door, and fumbled for the handle. Then he patted his pockets, glanced around, lowered his head in despair, and made one final, futile grab. It turned out he had dropped his keys. Tears streamed down my face as I watched him crouch before the very door against which I had braced the cabinet. Head bowed. Then the recording ended. The man at the computer pressed stop, his eyes lingering on the screen. I stood there, numb. My mind spun. I couldn't believe it. And yet, it was unmistakable. I thought back to the moment when I'd been sitting on the floor, just a half-meter away from him, my back against that shelf. We'd been nearly back to back. While he had been bleeding out, I felt his blood seep through the gap under the door onto my pants. The children had quietly sung a little song, and he had died out there, alone. And it was my fault for not opening the door. "I didn't know," I stammered, feeling ice cold. I stepped back from the officers. "I never meant to. I locked him out." One of the officers looked genuinely dismayed. "Ms. Johnson, we're not blaming you. In fact, because it was me, wasn't it?" I felt as if I were floating, even as I sank. My legs gave out. "I'm going to jail, right? Oh God, I let him die. Please, calm down." "But I shoved that damn cabinet against the door," I protested. The officer shook his head and raised a hand as if to steady me. Then everything went black, and I collapsed. That day, I stopped coming to work as a school social worker. In truth, I simply vanished. Janine took over as my public face, explaining everything to the district. My unexplained disappearance was officially recorded as a resignation. No one objected. No one demanded my presence or even my signature. No one bothered to check on me. Because they all knew that I had let him die out there. Later, Janine told me that our colleagues had expressed sympathy and that everyone understood our predicament. I couldn't bear their sanctimonious condolences. I shredded every "get well soon" card and popped every "we miss you" balloon they sent. I couldn't stand their hypocritical pity. especially when I'd left the principal, Daniel Hoffman, a married man with 2 kids and 253 students under his care, alone in an empty hall. I never speak his name now, referring to him only as the principal, as if he were just another colleague. As if I had never wept on his shoulder when my own relationship was falling apart, or when he had once gone over budget during our school's Christmas gift exchange just to get me a personal present. To top it all off, it turned out the active shooter alert had been completely unfounded. The police had been called because a local resident claimed to see an armed man near the school. In the end, officers encountered a very intoxicated man, loudly ranting in the neighborhood and carrying what appeared to be a handgun. There was even a brief standoff before he finally surrendered. The punchline: the gun turned out not to be a real weapon at all, but a paintball marker. Yet, none of that hurts nearly as much as the thought that continues to haunt me. I only needed to look just once. There were 2 moments when a simple glance could have saved everything. One was when I was lurking around that corner. I could have peeked, seen him, and waved him in before he stepped onto that wet patch of floor. Then he would have come straight to me instead of slipping. Or, later, when Janine and I reassured the children for the 2nd time by saying, "Everything's safe." For a fleeting moment I sensed something was wrong because we didn't hear anyone leaving. Instead, there was silence. I almost went to our little door window, pulled back the curtain, and just looked. But the protocol said never to expose yourself at windows or doors, and I was too frightened. So I ignored my instinct and hid behind the rules. Had I looked, I would have seen the blood trail right there by the door, and a motionless man standing before it. I might have panicked, yes, but in that panic I could have pushed the cabinet aside, opened the door, and perhaps pressed that big green blanket against his wound. I would have done something, but I didn't. I was a coward. At night, when I lie awake, I still hear that dull thump. I hear the principal's shuffled footsteps in my apartment, even though I have a carpet. I hear his shoulders scraping against the wall. And finally, I hear the heavy impact and the rattling of my locked bedroom door. I can almost imagine him shaking the doorknob. Then I bolt upright and tear the door open, every single time. And every single time, without exception, I break down in tears because there's never anyone there.